Welcome to micro lecture 3.1 in the Legal and Governance series. In this micro lecture we will zoom into the governance in the construction sector. In this micro lecture we will do three things. We will first describe the governance modes that are dominant in the construction sector. Second, we turn our attention to the causal factors that explain this situation, which causes are available in the construction sector that make that certain governance modes are more chosen than others. The third subject is that of the consequences of the dominant governance modes. What are the results of the choices that are made in this sector? The micro lecture is related to two papers by Dubois and Gade. The first one is more descriptive. It describes the dominance of certain governance mode in the sector. The second one is more analytical and it pays more attention to the causes and the consequences of these choices. We will describe four characteristics of the governance in the construction sector. First, we see that different companies work together in building unique buildings and temporary projects. And these companies mainly have a division in roles. There will be a main contractor and different subcontractors. Second characteristic is that we see functional specialization. We have submarkets that have developed for specific activities, for instance in installation or in electricity work. The third point is there is competitive tendering in selection of these partners. So there is market governance in getting these partners. The last characteristic is that we see local adjustment of activities on site using standardized parts. All kinds of standardized parts, bricks or wood or whatever, are used on site and they are locally used and adjusted to each other in order to build the building. Now, in order to compare the construction sector, we will take an example of another production sector, and that is that of the car industry. The first characteristic is that we see different companies work together and they have different roles, as indicated before. This implies that we have very seldomly or almost never the situation where one company does all the work. Of course, in terms of governance, that would be the governance form of hierarchy. What's important to understand is that the buildings that they make are usually unique. Of course, this is specifically the case if these buildings are complex and large. If we talk about the building of specific houses, you might see that there are larger projects where a number of houses of the same type will be built. But even then, that involves a temporary project. Once the series of houses is built on a specific location, the cooperation between the different companies that are involved will end. If we compare that to the car industry, the most important difference is, of course, that in the car industry we have large series of the same model. Of course, you will find the situation where different companies are involved. So, for instance, a car manufacturer might have a supplier that provides the gearbox for a specific model. But of course, the cooperation is extended for the entire series of the car. It's not for one car, but for the entire series of the model, the same company will be used. Now, from the micro lecture on organization, we know that organization has a lot to do with specialization. What's typical for the construction sector is that we find functional specialization. Different companies specify in doing specific activities. So you would have a company that does work in electricity, a company that would do work in installation, and you even have companies that have specialized in finishing walls. What they provide is not final products, but they provide services, they provide activities that are adapted to the unique building that is being built. So what is done actually in terms of electricity depends, of course, on the layout of the building, the installation, the size of the installation and the type of stuff that is used. depends on the characteristics of the building as well. And of course you can only start finalizing a wall once the wall has been built. If we compare that to the car industry, where we had our example of the gearbox company providing some work, of course there might be some adaptation of the design of the gearbox to a specific model, but once that's been done, all gearboxes will be the same and they will be provided as a finalized product. So the finalized product is then delivered to the main company and they will use all those gearboxes in the same way. And of course this also implies that there doesn't need to be any coordination anymore, because the car company knows what the specifications of the gearbox will be and they can just use it. Whereas in the construction sector, things have to be adapted on site to the local characteristics of the building that's being built, and that involves a lot of coordination and adaptation. Now, the selection of all these partners is done on the basis of competitive tendering, and of course that's the idea of market governance that we already discussed. And this tendering, the contracts that are made are of course for the duration of the project. Once the project has finished, the building has been built, of course there will be new projects, but then the partners will be selected again based on competitive tendering. So if you have a contract today with a company, it's not necessarily the case that you will get the contract for the next project. This does not only apply for the partners that deliver the services, the activities, but also for the materials that are used. So in selecting the different materials that the main contractor and subcontractors use, they themselves will again use competitive tendering for buying the standardized parts that they need. If we compare this to the example of the car industry and the gearbox company, then of course the selection of the partner as such in the beginning of the production of the series will be based on competitive tendering as well. But of course the duration of the project is for a longer time because it's extended for the entire series of the production of the model. What's also a little bit different is that because the product has to be used so many times by the main car company, usually they will spend some time in tuning the design of, for instance, the gearbox, so that they know that it will work perfectly well. Now, in doing that, it's quite logic that the gearbox company will cooperate and exchange knowledge with the main car company. And of course, by investing in exchanging this knowledge, they get to know each other, and it's more likely also that the same company that produces the gearboxes might be elected for a next series of a model by the main company. Again, this is not necessarily the case. Basically, it will be on competitive tendering under market conditions. But the relations are usually more extensive because a lot of time has been invested in making the design of the specific product. Now, the last part that we want to discuss is that of local adjustment of activities on site using the standardized parts. So the people that work for the different companies, they have to do their work on one specific site, and that's the building site where the building is done, where the building is erected. So they all come together, they work together sometimes at the same time, and of course this means that there is a strong linkage between the activities of the different companies and the people that work there. And they are of course highly dependent on each other. If a member of one company wants to build in a certain room, this usually means that people that need to do other work can't work in the same room as well, because they are hampering each other. So this involves a lot of coordination of the activities of people on the workplace. And there is also a high dependency because the work of one has consequences of the other. If the work of people from one company is not sufficient, then it will have consequences for other people that have to do additional work on the same location, on the same spot. So this involves, again, a high need for coordination of the activities of the people that work for the different companies. Now, if we compare that to the car industry, the work that people do is usually done in their own factory. So the gearbox company, the people that work there, they just produce the gearboxes in their own time, in their own space, and the finalized product is then sent to the main car company, and then they will do the work that they need to do, assembling the gearbox in the car. So there is no interlinkage between the work that they do, and there is less need for coordination. The only coordination that's needed is to make sure that the gearboxes are in time for the car company to do the work. Now, this governance form has been summarized in the papers by a graphical representation that is shown here. What we see projects represented by larger circles, where firms represented by squares contribute their resources working on the project, working on the building. And these resources also refer to the people that are working for the different companies. So for instance, in the central project, you see people working from companies A, B, and C together on a building. And these companies are also active in other projects where they have other people that do the work. So these are represented by the other larger circles. Now, the label that the authors use is that of temporary networks within networks, and they see it as a combination of loose and tight couplings. Now, in order to make sure that you understand things clear, it's perhaps good to tell you a bit more about how that works in our own theoretical models. The idea of tight couplings are referring to the situation in the projects. In the project, people are highly dependent on each other and they have to coordinate their activity largely. And that resembles to a certain extent the fact that there is like a temporary network with lots of coordination and adaptation. Now, over different projects, the relations are indicated by loose couplings by the authors. And they see that also as a typical part of networks, but in our terminology, these loose tight couplings are governed by market conditions. The idea of loose couplings is that there are no durable relations, and people are selected for different projects under competitive tendering, so under market conditions. So if they refer to loose couplings, that is market conditions in our terminology. So after the discussion of the dominant governance modes, it's important to go to the second point of this micro lecture, which is about the factors that explain this situation. We will distinguish three typical factors. The first is the separation between design and production. The second is that the construction sector is building prototypes. And the third one is that there is a community of practice that supports all this. We will discuss these issues subsequently. Now, the first factor that is really important is the separation between design and production. Architects who do the design of buildings, they work in different companies, in separate companies on their own. They don't work for construction companies. They have a strong professional orientation, and it stresses the art of design rather than the efficiency of the production process. They are not experts in what it takes to build buildings, they are experts in design. And this of course results in the unique buildings that we are talking about. And the design comes first, both in time and in priority. If a building is made, first, if you want a building, first you have contact with the architect that designs the building and talks to you about the aesthetics and the functionality of the building. And after the design is made, you will then select a construction company that does the work. So both in terms of timing and also in terms of priority, where the design is looking for, this is not about building of the building, but rather the design and the wishes of the client and the orientation of the architect. Now, an additional feature that is relevant here is that the design is protected by copyright regulations. The architect has a copyright on the design of the building. And it's important to understand that this is not only for the production of the building, so the building as such, but it also extends to the situation after the building has been made. Now, if we compare that to the situation of the car industry, there the design will be done much more in the car company itself. Of course, there are people who are specialized in car design, but they will work very strongly together with the people that are responsible for producing the car. So the characteristics that make it easy and efficient to produce the car already taken into account in the design as such. And of course the copyright situation is different as well. We can look at an example of what that means. Now, if you buy a car, you become the owner, and of course that means that you can do with the car whatever you like. And you see very many examples of that. For instance, people will tune their car and it will turn to look something like this. And that's perfectly allowed because you become the owner. Now, in the construction sector, the situation is different. Here we have the design of the designer, and it's protected by copyright law. We can look at an example. This is a picture of a speed skating ring in the municipality of Deventer in the Netherlands. And as you can see, it was designed in such a way that people skating at the outside were protected from rain, but in the middle of the section there is no roof, and people that would skate over there, they would get wet. And the municipality decided that it was time to build a roof over that part of the area. Now, of course, this would change the design of the architect, and because it was protected, he had to be consulted and he had to agree on the design of the roof. And the implication of that is that the roof currently looks like this. So you can see that it's adapted to the design, and this was according to the wishes of the architect. So you can see that this situation of the designer is rather different in the construction sector than in other sectors, and it has huge implications for the uniqueness of the buildings that are being built. Now, the uniqueness of the design implicates that the construction sector is actually involved in the building of prototypes. What is a prototype? A prototype in a normal production situation is the production of a test model that is made before you are going into series production. And quite often, for instance, in the car industry, it's not only about prototypes, but you also have pre-production models of the car that is going to be built. Now, in the construction sector, there is only a one-off building process. So what you see as the building of the prototype is actually already the final product. So this has a couple of implications. For instance, the important thing is that the design as such consists of drawings and the description in words of the work that has to be done. Now, these are of course always incomplete specifications of what the production process actually looks like. In other companies, in other production processes, the specification of the actual production process is of course done in the prototype building. But again, this is already in the building when we are looking at the construction sector. And of course it also means that there is a lot of adaptation going on, which is usually in other industries done again in the prototype phase, but this is now on site in the actual building of the building process if we look at the construction sector. The result is that there is a lack of uniformity. Things have to be done on the spot. We already indicated there's a high dependency of the work of the different people coming from the different companies that work together on the construction side. and one of the implications is also that the process is very vulnerable for mistakes. In other industries, the mistakes are taken out of the production process in the prototypes and the pre-production series. That's actually why they do that and why they invest a lot of time in that. In the construction sector, if something goes wrong, it's actually already in the building, so it has to be either corrected on the spot, or we have to live with the mistakes that were made in the building and they become part of the final product that is being made. Now, a third factor that is important for the choices that are made is the development and the availability of a community of practice. And this is specifically relevant for the functioning of the submarkets as a way of selecting the different partners for the work. What does the community of practice refer to? It refers to different forms of standardization. So there is the standardization of the division of the different activities in submarkets on the sector level. All companies that work in the construction sector, they have the same type of submarkets that are available. It involves the standardization of training. If you hire a company for installation, you will know that the people that work for that company have specific expertise and specific skills in terms of doing work in terms of the installation. It refers to standardization of roles. Each submarket company will always do comparable work and comparable activities of their competitors. And of course, this enables you to choose between them. A final point of standardization is the standardization of contracts. From the legal part, you have studied or you will study the specific conditions that are used in the construction sector, and these are contracts that are used over and over again by the companies that work in the sector. And all these forms of standardization together, they enable the functioning of the market, because for a market to function well, it needs to be clear what the different parties on the market can do, and the offers that they make on the market have to be comparable. So therefore, a standardization in terms of skills and the work that they do is necessary. Standardization of contracts plays an important role in reducing the transaction costs. If there is no standardization of contracts, then the bargaining costs would be very extensive, especially if you are looking for the complex work that is done in the construction sector, and these costs are limited because of standardization. Now, standardization works well in terms of providing efficiency. That's what you already learned in the micro lecture on the organization of work. Of course, there's a result of that as well. It always comes at the cost, and that is that the work is fixed. So there is less flexibility because things are done usually in the same way, and sometimes you need for flexibility, or for instance you need innovation, and that's difficult under these conditions of standardization. After discussing the factors that were responsible for explaining the dominant governance mode, it's time to pay attention to the consequences. We will discuss 4 consequences: fierce price competition. We will discuss a number of transaction costs that are relevant. There is limited learning and durable adaptation, and there are high costs of mistakes. A first consequence is that of fierce price competition, and that is of course directly related to the idea of market relations. Markets are supposed to result in efficiency because they reduce the production cost, because in order to get selected, the different producers on the market have to reduce their production costs. A second implication of the market relations is that the decisions that these different participants make are made in their own interest. They only take their own interest into account. This holds for the designers, who are principally oriented to design and the aesthetics and the functionality of the design. It's about the interests of the main contractor that has the contract with the buyer or the employer, as they are sometimes called in legal terms. But it also holds for the subcontractors. All these participants have to make their decisions in terms of their own interests, and they do not take the interest of the other participants into account. And that's a direct result of the market conditions that are used. Now, if we look at the transaction costs, they are to a large extent related again to the market conditions that are used. So if we look for the search costs, they are usually high because there is a lot of tendering involved. And this is not only high if you want to select a producer, you want to buy a building and you have to select a company, but the search costs are also linked to the offerings that the different producers have to make. So they have to bid in a tendering process. So for instance, if there are 10 competitors involved in a specific tender, then they all have to make an offer. And because it involves complex buildings, there's a lot of work involved. And of course, only 1 out of 10 is actually selected. So the other 9 have made search costs in providing the bid, but they will not get paid for it. So there is a lot of costs involved in the search process. Then the bargaining costs. First part of the bargaining cost is getting an agreement of what has to be done. And again, these are high if we are talking about unique buildings that are to be built, and they are usually very complex. So describing what has to be done involves a lot of work. On the other hand, it involves the formalization of the agreement, and we already indicated that standard contracts are used here, and they of course reduce the cost of settling the deal. Specific investments, they are low because of standardization and the selection process. Again, we indicated that companies are used to doing specific work, and you only select those companies that are able to do that in the first place. So the companies themselves, they don't need to have a lot of variation in terms of specific investments. On the other hand, they are increased because we are involved in prototype building. Prototype building, as we already learned, involves a lot of adaptation and coordination between the different people that work there. So there are 2 different aspects that work in different directions here. The monitoring costs, they are usually pretty high, and that's related to the specific design that is being made and the prototype building. Again, it involves a lot of inspection. There are serious possibilities of mistakes that we already described, and this makes it very important to be sure what is going on the workplace, on the site where the work is actually done. So people have to really be involved in monitoring, and this is from the part of the designer, but also from the part of the client that is really buying the product. And it also involves relations between the main contractor and the subcontractor. Switching costs, they are usually low, as the idea of switching is a normal standard part of market conditions. So you are used to that, and because things are organized in this way, the switching costs as such are not very high. A third type of consequence is that of limited learning and durable adaptation. Again, related to the market relations, they are not durable, they are only there for one project. So it results in low specific investment and a limited number of shared product developments. And that is because it's difficult to recoup the investments that you make, because your cooperation is not durable, it's only limited for one project. And the result is also that knowledge is usually kept within the own company. Again, this is a standard implication of market relations, where you don't want your knowledge to spill over to your competitors, so you keep it to yourself. There is also the situation that solutions that you might have found for a specific problem in a specific project are of limited use in subsequent projects because the designs are unique. So you will not face the same problem again in a next project, and that makes the usability of the solutions that you have limited. This also refers to the fact that in some cases even knowledge gained on local building processes do not spread within the own company. As is indicated in the graphical representation, people from one company will be involved in different projects. So the knowledge that is gained in one project might not spread to people working on other projects just because they don't have any contact with each other. A final consequence is that there are high costs of mistakes. And we already indicated that there is separation of work by different companies. They are guided by their own interests, and they don't take interests of others into account. Mistakes are common, and of course this is related to the fact that you are building prototypes. So mistakes occur, and that is only natural because it's a one-off production process. What is also important is that mistakes by one participant will have consequence for other participants. Taken all together, the costs of failure are really high in the construction sector, and there are estimates that this is about 11% of turnover. Yeah, so this is actually very high. Be aware this is 11% of turnover. It's not 11% of profits. No, it's 11% of turnover. And compared to other industries, that number is really high. Okay, after we have discussed these consequences, it's time to think about whether there might be reasons to change the choices in terms of governance modes and the dominance of market conditions. So would there be reasons to develop more network kind of relations, or perhaps even go for hierarchies as well? There are, of course, a number of considerations here. Why would you do this? Of course, the first reason would be to integrate design and production. If you were able to integrate those two, you could adapt the design to optimize production from the start, as is done usually in other types of industries, for instance the car industry, and that might reduce the cost of production process. You might reduce transaction costs, of course, by looking for different modes of governance. We talked about that in an extensive micro lecture. So if you would go for network relations, that would usually reduce the selection cost because you know the people that you want to work with. It can reduce bargaining costs because you are used to working with each other and you know what to do. It will reduce monitoring costs because you have only trustworthy partners and you know that you can depend upon them, because otherwise, if they are not producing good stuff, you will not go into network relations with them. Network relations will also improve options for learning and innovation. You are likely to share resources so you can do something new. You can share benefits, of course, and this is also a way of increasing efficiency in terms of the production process. Now, in market conditions, production becomes efficient because the separate partners become efficient in order to be competitive. In network relations, the efficiency is reached because you coordinate your activities over the different partners. So it's not within the different companies, but by sharing work together and adapting that and producing new stuff, you are able to make your work more efficient. And the final reason is, of course, to reduce costs of failure. If you come to work with other partners over and over again, you will be able to have less mistakes, because you know what they want and how they work, and the coordination as such is on site, on the building site, is much more easy. Of course, all these different developments, these benefits, could be produced by hierarchies as well. So hierarchies are also very well able to integrate stuff, to reduce transaction costs, to improve options for learning and innovation, and to reduce costs of failure. But as we know from the previous paper that we discussed by Jones and others, there are also certain conditions that let you move away from hierarchies, making them less attractive. And two of the most important ones are demand uncertainty, and that is very common in the construction sector because of these unique buildings, and complexity. And again, buildings are pretty complex things to make, and therefore the production process is complex as well. So demand uncertainty and high complexity make it usually less attractive to go for hierarchy as a governance model. Again, of course, it's not the situation that this is never done and these choices are never made by companies, but in general they are somewhat less attractive than network relations would be. Okay, that's it. It's time to wrap things up on this rather extensive micro lecture, but again, this is of course also a very core element of this course. We discussed the dominant mode of governance in the construction sector, which is summarized by market conditions with strong local adaptation. There are a certain number of factors that explain this situation. It is about design-based prototypes, using standard practices of the different people that are involved. We discussed some consequences: price competition, transaction costs, limited learning, high cost of mistakes. And the negative ones, are then reasons to consider different alternatives in terms of networks or possibly even hierarchies in terms of organizing your work.